Putin's involved, and they're out front tonight. And morgues in China overflowing, full of people who were sick from COVID. The government, though, is saying that they're not COVID deaths. Why? We're live in Beijing tonight with a special report. Let's go out front. And good evening, I'm Erin Burnett. Out front tonight, Putin calls it a war. For the first time, Vladimir Putin using the word war to describe his brutal invasion of Ukraine. For 10 months, it's been called a special operation. In fact, the word war has been banned. And then today, hours after Zelensky visited with Biden in Washington, Putin said this.
Our goal is not to spin the flywheel of military conflict, but on the contrary, to end this war. We have been and will continue to strive for this.
War. Look, the word war is not semantics for Putin. Calling this a war, which again has not been allowed, it has been banned, it has serious implications because it allows Putin to call for full mobilization and impose martial law across Russia if he wants to. And Putin's use of the word war comes just after his defense minister said that Russia was going to be upping its fighting force by 500,000 soldiers. So it is unclear whether Putin finally slipped up in using the word war. But to be clear, it is not a word he has used in 10 months. And he said it as we are getting yet another phone call showing the dire straits among those Putin already has called to his front lines. This intercept was provided to us by Ukrainian intelligence. And what you're going to hear tonight is a call from a Russian servicewoman. And she's talking about just how bad things are for those who are in Putin's army. Listen for yourself.
They don't give a about people anywhere. It's everywhere, not just here. It's so awful. Nobody cares about anyone. They just made camp here in this forest of small trees, without any shelter or building, nothing. When they arrived, they moved here and there, but in the end, they made camp under the open sky, among some small trees. They built a shelter from the ammunition boxes. It's unbelievable. Nobody gives a about the people. It's the same everywhere.
At the top, when she says they, she's referring to the commanders. They, the commanders, don't give an F about people anywhere. And this intercept comes as newly released U.S. intelligence shows that the Wagner Group is growing even more influential. A top U.S. official is saying today that this group, a mercenary group, of course, in Putin's Russia, is now getting weapons from North Korea. And this matters because Wagner Group is notoriously one of the most brutal forces in the world, even more brutal than Putin's actual army, which has already committed some of the worst known atrocities in this war. And tonight, for the first time, reporters have spoken with Russian soldiers who were responsible for some of those atrocities, the massacre of civilians in Bucha. It is a massacre that Putin himself has denied, despite the clear evidence.
The dead bodies have been lying in the ruins for months on end, decomposing. But nobody cared about them before that, and no one even noticed, just as no one remembers the hundreds of dead civilians in Afghanistan. Then it turned out that it was all just a fake, just like the fake in Bucha.
Of course, there was no fake in Bucha. In just a moment, I'm going to speak with one of the reporters who found the soldiers who did these atrocities, who committed to them, and then actually spoke to them on the phone. But first, Will Ripley is on the ground in Kyiv tonight, awaiting news of the return of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. What are you learning, Will?
Just one note on Bucha, Aaron. I stood near a mass grave with 100 men, women, and 2 children, so definitely that was not a fake situation. People watched their neighbors sit in the streets and rot for a month because they were afraid that the Russian soldiers would shoot them too, execution style, if they moved them. That was the reality of life occupied by Russia for people who were living in a suburb of Kyiv. Now, we don't know if President Zelensky is back here in Kyiv just yet. We do know that there has video that has emerged tonight from the Polish border where he met with the president of Poland, President Duda, I should say, and the obvious, if he was taking the train like he did on his way out, he would have arrived here, back here by now. But his movements are kept a very carefully and closely guarded secret for obvious security reasons. But he did have that meeting with the Polish president. We know that his wife, the First Lady of Ukraine, appeared at a conference of ambassadors today. It would make sense if he were to make an appearance tomorrow as the conference does continue. But where that is, whether he'll be showing up, what he'll be saying, that those are all open questions. Meanwhile, significance of Putin calling this a war. Russia has been making up their own narrative throughout this whole conflict, Aaron. But one of the lines they said today was really striking after the Zelensky-Biden meeting. They said the West is responsible for turning Ukraine, in their words, into a hostile terrorist state. They're saying that the West turned Ukraine into a hostile terrorist state as they continue bombing the civilian infrastructure, making life miserable for millions of people here.
All right. Well, Ripley, thank you very much. Live in Kyiv tonight. And out front now, I want to go to Yusar Alhelu, video journalist for the New York Times. And Yusar, I mentioned the incredible investigation that you and your team have done over months about the massacre in Bucha. So can you tell me how you were able to trace the Russian soldiers, right? This isn't just like, okay, it's Russian soldiers. You got the exact unit and where they're from and their faces and their names, who these individuals are, and then got them on the phone.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. And yeah, it was, like you mentioned, a months-long process. And like your colleague who was on the camera earlier, I was also in Bucha in the earliest days of its liberation in early April and was witness to the bodies that were strewn along the roads. And in one street in particular were dozens of bodies, some with their hands tied, that had been executed. So my colleague Masha Froliak and I decided, along with our colleagues in New York, to set out to find out who killed these people, these Ukrainian victims, along one street. And through the course of our reporting, we heard from residents who lived along the street that their phones had been routinely confiscated. So when Russian soldiers trespassed and entered their homes to interrogate them and to search for men of military age, they took their cell phones. So we asked ourselves, could they have taken cell phones of victims? Can we identify who might have pulled the trigger or who might have been near that scene of crime using that sort of piece of evidence? So while interviewing families of those victims, we asked for their relatives, their dead relatives' cell phone numbers. And at the same time, we obtained hundreds of thousands of phone records from Ukrainian authorities. And we did a very simple search function, which is Command F. We took every single one of the 40 victims' phone numbers and we we looked for them in the phone logs. And we found that along this one road, of at least 41 victims, 6 cell phones were used to dial Russia. 6 cell phone numbers belonging to 5 Ukrainian victims were being used routinely throughout the month of March. So while we can't say that the soldiers who dialed back home to Russia killed those victims, we can say that those soldiers were near the scene of the crime within hours of the killings of those victims.
And you then called those numbers, right? I mean, those cell phones are in Russia, and you spoke to the people on the other end of the line, ostensibly, whether it's soldiers or the families they gave these phones to. I mean, tell me about one of those conversations.
So it was a multi-step process to identify the soldier, because the number that was dialed was a relative's phone number. So Masha, my colleague, and I analyzed, we identified using that phone number who the relative was, and by analyzing the social media accounts, we figured out who the soldier was in that family. I don't speak Russian. My incredible colleague, Masha, does. So together we prepared for the questions, and Masha placed those phone calls. She spoke to dozens of family members of over 2 dozen soldiers, and in 2 instances spoke to the actual soldiers themselves. Those 2 soldiers confirmed their military unit, and they confirmed that they were in Bucha. One of those soldiers admitted that their command was to clear the road to Kyiv. And he admitted that it was a systemic and deliberate clearing operation, meaning that anyone in their way, civilian, non-combatant, was ground for killing.
So admitted essentially to doing it, if not to a specific murder. What was that conversation like?
So I think in preparing for these conversations, Masha and I, so just to clarify, it was, ultimately it was Masha who was on the phone, but our goal was to establish the presence of these soldiers. Could we say that these soldiers were in Bucha, and could we say which unit they belonged to? And ultimately, we were able to identify that 24 soldiers belong to one military unit, and that's the 234th Regiment of the 76th Division, which is a paratrooper unit from Western Russia. As they moved along one road over days and eventually over a month, they kept a trail of evidence. They kept using victims' phones, and they kept killing civilians.
And then would take those phones and use them to call. It's incredible. It's incredible to imagine it, and it's amazing that you were able to track it down and to do that extensive forensic work. Thanks so much to you, Yusra, for coming and for telling us about it, and of course, all the hard work of you and Masha and your other colleagues as well.
Thank you very much.
And I want to go now to Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, now Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Evelyn, you know, when you listen to Yusra lay this out, right, that it seems that the Russians were systemically doing this. They admit to it, but literally would take the cell phones of people after they killed them, of innocent civilians, and use them to call home. And then bring them home, give them to their relative, and to get that cell phone. Just to imagine this, right? I know we've talked about it, but Yusra and her team have actually showed this happened.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so impressive how much evidence, Aaron, we can garner now using modern technology. There were some comparisons I saw on the internet, and I served in Bosnia after that war. All they had were photographs. They didn't have what we have today, video, and then phone records that you can trace back to people. But it's pretty horrific. I mean, the killing is against the Geneva Conventions, and then taking the phones, that's looting. And the fact that they can do that and sleep at night is pretty mind-boggling.
Right, especially because as they do this investigation, right, you're talking weeks and months, right? These phones are being used. They're now just like, great, we have a new phone. It's like part of their life. Which has some sort of a level of sick banality to it, for lack of a better description. Evelyn, you know, Putin uses the word war today for what seems to be the first time, a word that has been banned. Okay, if his use of that word ends up being purposeful, it means he can do complete martial law, he can do complete and total mass mobilization. If he were to move in that direction, if that's what this is about, what would it mean?
Well, I think, Aaron, it would mean a lot of unrest in Russia. And when we saw when he announced the partial mobilization, which was supposed to be only people who had military experience, which of course was a lie because they were grabbing people off the metro, you know, off the subways in Russia without checking if they had experience. And they were also taking demonstrators and sending them to the front. So if indeed he's now saying it's a war and he can mobilize any Russian men of military age or perhaps older, that will make a lot of Russians uncomfortable, and I think you'll see more of them fleeing. You already have seen the opposition, of course, quite angry because there are many people in jail right now, including Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was one of the pallbearers for Senator McCain's funeral, a very well-known Russian activist dissident. People are in jail serving real time for having called the war a war when it was illegal, and it's still technically illegal. So They're saying Vladimir Putin should also serve 7 years.
Right. And it'd be amazing to see what happens here because, okay, it could have been a slip of the tongue, but that is not something the Russian president has done. It's not a mistake he has made in 10 months. It is a word with great meaning to him. Thank you very much, Evelyn. I appreciate your time. And next, was it witness tampering? We have new transcripts coming in from the January 6th probe as we've been covering this week. Star witness Cassidy Hutchinson says she felt pressure by her Trump-aligned attorney. Plus, look at this picture. The former president of Georgia, pro-West president, just 1 year ago, and now in prison. Here's what he told me, warned about his foe, Vladimir Putin, on this show in 2017.
The only thing that America cannot afford to show the Russians that America is weak.
Tonight he's dying in prison. His lawyer and son say Putin is to blame. And tonight, was he poisoned by Putin? Just look at this. On the left, Putin foe Mikhail Saakashvili 1 year ago. On the right, Saakashvili today. His lawyers arguing in court today that the former president of the country of Georgia, a longtime Putin adversary, was poisoned. They say that tests show heavy metals in his body, and they say Putin is behind it. And you are going to hear the details in just a moment. Because today, Saakashvili looked extremely frail. He attended this court hearing remotely. It was his first public appearance in months after he was imprisoned for corruption upon return to Georgia from the United States. Saakashvili's appearance coming just after the Ukrainian President Zelensky publicly called on the Georgian government to release Saakashvili. Now, Mikhail Saakashvili is a man I've known for years. He's appeared on this show multiple times. He was a loud champion for Georgia on the world stage. He fought against Putin when Putin invaded Georgia. And here is what else Saakashvili says is now happening to him in prison.
Do you recall specifically the time that you were beaten when they removed your watch?
At that time, they were choking me and strangling me and beating my hands like this, something like that.
And were they stepping on your neck?
They were stepping on my neck. It's all video, so they deleted the video that would show it better.
Nick Payton Walsh is out front to begin our coverage with more on Mikhail Saakashvili's story.
This is what's become of one of the most influential men in the post-Soviet world, Mikhail Saakashvili, allegedly throwing things at an unidentified figure in a clinic in his native Georgia. He's in prison there on charges he says are trumped up. The authorities released these pictures to show what they call his, quote, abuse and aggressive behaviour. The trailblazing former president has been on and off hunger strike, demanding better medical care. This week, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed to Georgia to give him just that. Please make a decision that can save his life, the president said. Transfer Mikhail Saakashvili to one of the clinics in Ukraine, another European country, America. The new thorn in Putin's side, standing up for the first. The young American-trained lawyer led street protests to unseat Georgia's long-serving president, former Soviet Eduard Shevardnadze, back in 2003. The so-called Rose Revolution was a shot of freedom in the region's arm, where similar protests would follow.
They will stay here overnight and for as long as it's necessary to stop mass-scale fraud and rigging of these elections.
He was the face of liberty, fluent in many languages, and caused panic in the Kremlin. The darling of US neocons, Saakashvili soon found himself at war with Russia in 2008, a brief conflict in which Putin said he would hang him by his balls. He didn't, and Georgia and its president survived. But by 2013, Saakashvili left office unpopular and protested against, despite the widespread reform he had imposed on Georgia. He got a second lease of life when he left for Ukraine, but it was sweet, then suddenly sour. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko in 2015 gave him Ukrainian citizenship so he could govern the region around Odessa. But they quickly fell out when Saakashvili accused Poroshenko of corruption. Then began an ugly series of scenes, arrests, protests, leading to Saakashvili's return to Georgia to face trial for abuse of power and hospitalization after hunger strikes. His rise and fall, a parable of Russia's continued grip over its empire. Nick Payton Walsh, CNN, London.
And that, of course, was Nick Payton Walsh with that reporting. Now I want to bring in Massimo D'Angelo, one of Mikhail Saakashvili's lawyers, and Edward Saakashvili, his son. Edward, I want to start with you and show the side-by-side of your father again. Just 1 year ago, right after he was arrested, compared to how he looks today, frail and weak. And these pictures are stark for anyone, but for you, Edward, how hard is it for you to see your father like this?
I mean, it's really awful. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's really awful. And I think, I mean, what's different for me is that I've actually had a chance to see him. You know, he was hidden for the public for months, but I've had a chance to visit him in prison over time. And like the painful part there has just been watching him slowly decline and then more quickly in the last few months. And in a way, as shocking as these images now are, and like the world is seeing how awful his health is, the upside is that at least now it's undeniable, you know, because the government's been making insinuations that it's all fake, etc. But when you see this footage, it's completely obvious how far he's declined. So that is kind of one benefit, at least, as shocking as it is, that now there's going to be hopefully more pressure and more, you know, outrage at what's happened.
Massimo, a moment ago, I played the audio clip that you had shared with us about Mikhail. He was detailing one instance of alleged abuse because of a watch he was wearing, is what he says this was about. He told you that he was assaulted when he was transferred from the prison to the hospital as well. And I wanted to play part of that exchange. Here it is.
I was dragged, kicked, beaten.
You were beaten?
Yeah, for sure.
When were you beaten?
When they forcibly took me out of the car, because under Georgia law, they had procedure. There is no right to take someone to hospital if there is no written consent.
So allegations of abuse, physical assault, suspected poisoning, rapidly deteriorating health, as Edward is talking about. Just to be clear, Massimo, you believe that Putin is behind this, right?
Yes, absolutely. And people forget, but in 2008, Putin did exactly what he's doing now in Ukraine to Georgia. Under color of darkness, he invaded Georgia. And just like President Zelensky is doing today in Ukraine, Saakashvili stood up and fought back. And because of this, the Kremlin and Putin specifically became his arch nemesis, number one enemy. And because of everything that Saakashvili did in westernizing the country, was adverse to what Putin wanted and the Kremlin wanted. And Saakashvili tried to announce to the world, and he foreshadowed everything that Putin is doing today to bring the Soviet Republic back and to annex the territories that were previously part of the Soviet Republic.
So Edward, you know, as Massimo is talking about, your father obviously was the president of Georgia when Putin invaded it in 2008. He knows Putin, and even after he left office, he spoke out whenever he could to warn other countries about Putin. He was very vocal about it. Here's some of what he told me. This is in 2017. I mean, he raised his voice. He said this. This is the Putin you know.
He likes people who can really manipulate and intimidate.
Play him.
You know, like, and the only thing that America cannot afford to show the Russians that America is weak, because the only thing Putin appreciates, everybody knows that, is sheer force.
Edward, your father believed Putin was a threat to the world. He took great risks to expose that. He returned to Georgia at risk of being imprisoned to make that, to stand up for that. Does he have any regrets now about speaking out or about returning?
I wouldn't say he has regrets about speaking out. I think he, very much continues to stand for what he's always stood for. But as for the return, I think, I don't want to speak for him. I would say that given what has happened, that was a misstep, because, obviously the writing was on the wall about how the Georgian authorities were going to react. Obviously, it's been way worse than any of us were expecting. It's one thing to put somebody in prison, and that's terrible for the family and everything. But to put somebody in this state after just a year of imprisonment, where they, quite obviously and literally are kind of on the verge of fighting for their life, that was unexpected. So I would definitely regret going back, knowing that that's what would happen. But of course, at the time, it was difficult to tell.
Right. And Massimo, when you talk about these heavy metals that have been, tested for in his body, do you know anything about these and why they lead you to think about poisoning and Putin, which of course, has been associated and accused of poisonings in the past? We know that that's sort of a fingerprint of Russia's tactics.
Sure. We certainly know that that's how they operate. And what we did is we composed a team of 5 independent medical experts, some of the top medical experts in the world, Nobel Peace Prize winners, Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and a well-known toxicologist. And while I was in Georgia, getting the tapes that we listened to earlier, my neurologist was there with me, and we took samples, hair and nail samples from Saakashvili, as well as a biopsy of some of his fat tissue in his stomach area. And we sent it back to a lab in the United States for testing. And those tests, along with some of the blood testing results that we received, revealed heavy metals, arsenic, mercury, among others. So that is what told us that he was being poisoned. In addition to that, he is undergoing what's called a polypharmacy. He is on a regimen of at least 14 different drugs, and most of which are non-FDA approved Russian drugs. One of them in particular is called Finibut, which is highly addictive. And to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, our toxicologist has indicated that Saakashvili needs immediate detoxification. And you can see the images from court today in his rapid decline. Yeah. And he's dying. And without U.S. assistance and EU assistance, he will die in prison, a political prisoner.
Edward, do you have hope that you will see your father again free and healthy?
I mean, I do have hope. It's a kind of hope against hope. It's a very difficult situation. And so, but there is some hope just because of the level of consensus that's now building that this is just completely unacceptable.
Well, Edward, thank you very much for joining us to talk about your father. And Massimo, thank you very much for being with us and sharing those tapes with us as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And next tonight, blizzard warnings are going up as more than 100 million Americans brace for a once-in-a-generation deep freeze. We have an up-to-the-moment live update for you, and heartbreak at the border, where the temperatures are dropping below zero soon. Meet the human beings affected by Title 42. You'll see a Venezuelan family who made it to the U.S. on foot and was expelled immediately to Mexico.
Nobody can tell ya. There's only one song worth singing. They may try and sell ya, 'cause it hangs them on to see someone like you. But you gotta make your
Life gets bigger when you break from the herd. The Volkswagen Tiguan.